Afternoon, everyone. Welcome back, and welcome for those who are here for the first time. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to welcome Kat Brooks from the Anti-Police Terror Project. I think in some ways this conversation it will be slightly different than conversations we've had to date. So for instance, the last 2 weeks, we've talked about how to reduce violence, especially among young people in communities that have been negatively affected by high rates of violence. What seems to be very clear is that in some communities of color, one of the perpetrators of violence are the police themselves. And so we thought that we would invite Kat Brooks here to share with us the work that she is doing with the Anti-Police Terror Project. Kat Brooks is the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. This network has been engaged in the struggle against state violence for well over a decade. After losing her father at the age of 8 to Nevada penitentiary system, she continued to witness the ways that law enforcement brutalized Black and Brown communities. So in 2009, after years of organizing around a myriad of social justice issues, Kat became deeply involved in the struggle for justice for Oscar Grant, which unbeknownst to her would forever change her life. Since that time, Kat has worked on the front lines of resisting state violence, including co-founding the Anti-Police Terror Project, whose mission is to rapidly respond to and ultimately eradicate police violence from communities of color. The Anti-Police Terror Project has trained thousands of people in their rapid response model, which is currently being implemented across the state of California and the country. So I'm really excited to have Kat become a part of this conversation that we've been having here at the Program in Criminal Justice for the past, what, I guess 8, 9 months maybe now. As is typical, Kat will engage in a conversation with me, and then I will share the floor with my colleague, my partner, Chris Winship, and then we will open it up for Q&A to the audience. As soon as you have questions that you want to ask, please put those questions in the chat, and then as soon as we open up the floor for questions, I will begin to call on those of you who have put your questions in the chat. So welcome so much to the Program in Criminal Justice. Kat, I am very excited to have this conversation with you today. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. And thank you to everyone who is logged in to have this conversation.
Absolutely. So let me start by asking you about the motivation to co-found the Anti-Police Terror Project. Can you share the experiences that led to the founding of this organization?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of all in the bio, right? This is about sort of how they all link together. And it took me a minute of doing this work to actually start the answer to that question earlier than when we founded APTP, right? And it really does go back to my own experiences growing up as a Black girl and then a Black woman in the United States of America. And I was born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada, which most folks think about, right? You see casinos and fun and party and all that other stuff, but it's an actual real city where real people live and have real life experiences. And when I was growing up, Vegas was like this big, and you could get, anywhere in 5 minutes, the whole town. The other thing that's really important to know about Las Vegas is that it was incredibly racially segregated. And that makes sense if you think about the two founding groups of Las Vegas, or at least the two groups that developed Las Vegas, and that's the Mormons and the mob. And so if you look at the anti-Blackness, right, that exists in both of those demographics, the fact that it was racially segregated in extreme violence against Black bodies, throw in cowboys and cowboy culture, and you're talking about a pretty deadly cocktail, right, for Black folks. And so I grew up hearing about law enforcement and experiencing racism. My mom's white, my dad's Black. And so that was the other thing, is that I would be with my mother on one side of Las Vegas, and then we would cross the proverbial, train tracks, and then I would be in the Black side. And was aware enough as a child to see the difference in quality of life, and how people were living, in access to certain types of food even then, and of course the way law enforcement treated us. I grew up hearing stories about Black folks being taken to the desert. In fact, that term 86, 8 miles out and 6 feet deep, that's what that means. And then my father did absolutely struggle with substance abuse issues. He's clean and sober and healthy now, and has been for, I don't know, 25, maybe 30 years now. And ultimately that landed him in prison. And even as but I was very close to my father, right? And he was a pretty central figure in my life. And what I understood even at a young age was that my daddy was sick, right? And that he needed help, and that being locked away in a cage, he was not going to get that help. And so, of course, then I'm not taking that then to, any larger analysis, but that was clear to me. Some of my early experiences with law enforcement included being pulled over because my boyfriend at the time, who was also white, was in the car having my car trashed by law enforcement, broke my dashboard, the whole thing, for literally for no reason, and then walking away laughing. I had a bumper sticker on my car that said, "Question authority." I was all of 17 when this happened. Also very early on in my life, the first time I was ever threatened with rape, it was by a cop. Again, around 17, 18. And in my younger years, watching my father be profiled, harassed, tossed around, though that was difficult. So my father's a big dude, so backup being called, and my father being tossed around by law enforcement. So all of these things, right, shaped me. And 1992, the beating of Rodney King, and that whole experience in the trial. I was senior in high school. That whole experience, and for Black people, right, knowing that these things happen in our community every day. Like Rodney King was not the exception to the rule; he was actually the rule. I'm assuming people know who he was. If not, he was a motorist in Los Angeles. He was pulled over. And Los Angeles, you should know, is one of the most notoriously violent police departments in the nation, has been for quite some time. And on camera, you catch these police officers, four, beating him. I mean, viciously beating him. The images, if you Google them, are horrific. And for Black people, there was this feeling like, oh my gosh, okay, finally, right? It's out there, right? Like that people are going to see what is happening to us, and there's going to be some vindication, some retribution, something. And we all were holding our bated breath, waiting for the verdict to come down, and those cops walked. I was still in high school at the time. I was going to Catholic school. Those of you who have also survived Catholic school, congratulations. We're still standing. And it was primarily white. And I remember running home to catch the verdict, because we literally could not talk about it on campus. Well, I couldn't talk about it on campus because I was a shit starter even then, which much less analysis, so meant more shit and less organizing. And turning on my TV, and Los Angeles was on fire. And I remember standing in my living room and just sobbing, right? Just sobbing. And again, that dehumanization of us. Didn't have the words for it at 17. So that was another big pivot point. My mother was very politically active. I mentioned that she was white, but I learned about white supremacy and Black oppression and the history of Black people in this country and the Black Panther Party. All of that came from my mom from a very young age, giving me books. So all of these things, right? And the first real job I had was as a communication specialist for an organization in Los Angeles called Community Coalition. It was founded by now Congress member Karen Bass. And that's where I learned to be an organizer, where that became my organizing home. And we were steeped in political education and studying movements and resistance movement, not just here in the United States, but globally, US impact on Black bodies globally. And I worked on a bunch of issues, and this is in my early 20s, everything from land use to people coming home from prison to family care versus foster care, to education, right? And the common denominator across all of those is that if you happen to be Black, your outcomes in any of those buckets are at the very, very bottom. And it was during my time at Community Coalition, a young 14-year-old kid stole a car. He must have been this big. And he stole a car, and instead of time and space and de-escalation. He was unarmed. LAPD just unloaded into this baby's into this baby's body. So we did some organizing around that. And I remember that jerking me in a particular kind of way, but kept it pushing. Had a baby, moved to Oakland to continue my education work, and had gone home to Las Vegas for the holidays, and came home, and I was getting ready to turn onto my block actually. And this brother was trying to flag me down, and he was like, "Where's the rally tonight?" And I was like, "What rally?" He said, "For that brother they killed." And I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Nevada is here, California is here, and the news cycle had not transferred, or had not made its way into Nevada, that on January 1st, 2009, a young Black unarmed man named Oscar Grant had taken the public transit home, and there was some sort of verbal exchange between the folks that Oscar was with and these other guys on the train. Oscar, within minutes, was called a bitch ass nigger, slammed to the ground, handcuffed, and shot in the back. I watched that video over and over and over again. I couldn't, I couldn't get myself out of the loop. My daughter was 2009. My daughter was 4. And me immediately making the connection that her body was not safe. And that was sort of it. I was working a regular job at the time, but every waking hour I had outside of that job was spent on supporting, as a volunteer, supporting the struggle for justice to Oscar. And off we went. And during that time, I met a group of amazing Black organizers, and we sort of were the frontline soldiers in that movement. We continued to organize with each other. We ultimately formed an organization called Onyx that was largely responsible for most of the protests you saw between 2010 and 2014. And then we had a conversation with each other, because we are all trained organizers, about what were we actually accomplishing. Like, it was great that we could pull like literally 7,000 to 12,000 people in the streets 24 hours like that. And we were responding to not just OPD murders, but murders that were happening across the country. It was we were capturing media, we were impacting the public debate, but the state just kept killing us. And so APTP was born to be not just a reactionary response to state violence, and we need that, right? Like, we need that. We could talk about why later, but a visionary response. So our mission is to interrupt, to rapidly respond to, interrupt, and ultimately eradicate state violence. And that's, if you look at our buckets of programming and the work that we do, that it'll make sense now.
So what does that mean in concrete terms? What do you do? Like, give me an example of some maybe recent event where you were activated in this way and engage in these activities that define APTP.
Right. So I'll do a couple of buckets here. So let's start with the first responders model. That was our first program. And what that is a literal step-by-step guide for communities to respond to incidents of state violence. Cops don't tell us the truth. We don't get the information. Communities are traumatized and families need support. And so we do all of those things. We train people in trauma-informed investigation. They learn how to collect evidence. They learn how to identify witnesses, how to protect the witnesses and any information that they capture. We've got a legal cohort that we put with the family right away that offer, pro bono legal support. We do healing justice work, both with the families and with the communities, because there's not even a word to talk about how traumatizing this is, both, especially for the family, but for Black people, period, right? Whether you're in the immediate neighborhood or around the country, we all screamed when we heard Breonna Taylor's. We all felt that in our bodies, right? Because we live hunted on American soil. So we help communities do vigils, et cetera. We do fundraising, we do organizing, of course. Because the other thing that's really important to note is that, you'll hear someone's name, even in big cases, right? Like Breonna's name isn't in the media every day. You hear it for a hot minute. these cases go on and on and on and on. We protect families because unlike in other instances where cops may knock on the door and offer their support to solve the murder, it flips. Families are stalked. The cops show up at their job. They sit outside their house. They call them and threaten them. Like it's a whole thing. And so we activated that. We had to activate that model a lot here in Oakland. Yvette Henderson, she was murdered in 2015. And what we ultimately discovered was that she had been shot with an AR-15 in broad daylight. She was a 38-year-old mother and grandmother. Now, we found that out not because law enforcement gave us that information, but because our first responders come from a wide array of backgrounds. They went through the protocols and they found the casing on the ground. And that was ultimately helpful to the family later on in their civil suit. Luckily, OPD hasn't murdered anybody here since 2018 directly because of the movement that we built here. But 2 days ago, we got a call in Sacramento and that chapter had to go out. We've trained people in Chicago, all throughout the South, Southern California, and Canada on that model. Alternative responses. Anti-Police Terror Project has developed what's called MH First, mental health first. We are a non-911 response to mental health crisis, interpersonal violence, substance abuse issues. And that's for a bunch of reasons, right? But the two big ones are that no matter how bad the emergency, there are large swaths of the Black community that aren't ever going to call 911 ever. It doesn't matter. And so that just means that survivors of violence and or people that are in deep crisis and need help don't get it. And that's because that's tied to the second reason that law enforcement very rarely de-escalates things in communities of color or makes it better, right? Almost always the situation is escalated, resulting in bodily harm, incarceration, or in the worst cases, murder. And the point of MH First is and alternative programs and our demand for these programs to be created and our hopefully inspiration, right? Our conversations with our allies and comrades across the country is that we can't tell people not to call the police if there's nothing else for them to call. We're all taught the exact same thing from time immemorial, right? That's the number you dial. Those are the people that keep us safe. But what happens when the people that are supposed to keep you safe are actually a bigger problem than the issue that you're calling about? And so we failed at that, and we hold some responsibility about that, and we call out our movement as a whole that we haven't made replicable models, small replicable models where we can show the masses that you actually don't need to respond to every single social ill with a badge and a gun.
So APTP has been described as deploying radical approaches or tactics that some find counterproductive. So for instance, in 2015, George Holland, you're already laughing, president of the NAACP's Oakland branch, said actions like ATP's BART takeover were counterproductive, that you're affecting people who didn't really have anything to do with the problem. And people lost their jobs because they weren't able to get to work because you shut down the BART, and other activities like this. How do you respond to these kind of critiques leveled against APTP?
Well, you're seeing part of how I respond to it. And it's not that I don't care, that we don't care about how other people feel. We just don't care as much as the fact that action was held because Mike Brown was murdered, right, in Ferguson, and it actually wasn't an APTP action. We led and supported it. That was actually the first action of the Black Lives Matter Bay Area chapter, of which I was a founding member. That chapter no longer exists. We held it on Black Friday, right, because from our perspective, you were getting on this train for the most part to go spend thousands of dollars on what? Meanwhile, Black death abounds in this country. And the other reason why I laugh is because, I'll just say it, George Harland is a tool. That conversation, that quote actually came from an article that a reporter did as a profile on me. And if you read the article, it was in the Mercury News. Matt, can't remember. Anyway, decent, reporter that actually knew that his job was not to be biased. His job was to tell the story, and I think did a decent job. including critiquing me. And George Olive was the only person he could find, right? The only person he could find was another Black person spitting nonsense. Here's no evidence that anybody lost their jobs. Nobody ever hit us up and said they lost their jobs. We shut down the bar. Our goal was to hold it for 4 hours and 28 minutes. That's how long Michael Brown lay in the street. We weren't able to hold it that long. We went to jail before that. We were our support teams were facilitating Ubers and Lyfts and taxi cabs for folks that were downstairs. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and as I say this, y'all do an internal examination. If we didn't put this issue in your face, you're not having the conversation, right? Because you don't have to. And if you're not having the conversation, then how are we going to get justice? And that's the piece I think that still gets my ire up, and where you may see me get, a little more excited. The normal is if white people were being gunned down at a rate of 1 to 3 a day, would that be cool? That'd be all right, right? Business as usual would just continue. But because it's Black people, then somehow we have this criticism that we have the audacity to assert our humanity with a very simple demand: stop killing us. So I tell you what, our business as usual is interrupted every single day, right? Because we're racially profiled and targeted, because we are raped by law enforcement, which is how Black women experience state violence for the most, because we are targeted at our jobs for what our hair looks like, because we are sending our children to substandard educational facilities, and they in turn are sending them to into the carceral state, because we are murdered, because we are beaten, right? That is the reality of being Black in this country. And so you're a couple of minutes late for work because we've taken the streets or taken the bridge or taken a bus. You can say that to me, and I'm going to hear you say that, and then I'm going to start spitting facts to you. And to me, your moral compass as a human being should be to agree with us that unarmed Black teenagers should not be gunned down in the street in broad daylight in the country that advertises itself as being the greatest democracy on earth.
So, of course, then my question would be, to what extent does that work in terms of opening up a dialogue with people who are not paying attention, haven't thought about it, are fairly apathetic about what's happening? To what extent does this engage those folks for whom apathy is the norm? One could argue apathy drives a lot of what doesn't happen here. Does stopping the BART, doing these other things, make that kind of difference?
I think the proof is in the pudding. I think where we are right now, 2021, the political moment we are in right now, the conversations we are having nationally about redirecting money from law enforcement, defunding police departments, and investing in programs and resources and supports that actually build true community safety, conversations about decarceration, alternative models for responses to things that don't require cops springing up all over the country. That didn't come out of this moment alone, right? I've heard people say, this is just at rallies, right? This is just the beginning. This is just beginning. This is the beginning of nothing. this is a moment on a continuum of a very long fight for Black justice, Black liberation in this country. African people have responded since the first one of us was kidnapped and dropped on these shores, and we continue to resist. And so I can talk about I say, where we are right now, this iteration, right? You have to look to 2009 in Oakland, California, and what we did, and look to the fact that was also the time of Arab Spring. And people were in Egypt holding up signs that said, "I am Oscar Grant." You have to think about the organizing and the phone calls, all the stuff that you don't see on camera, right? The calls that I'm on with organizers in Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles, the networks that we've built, the papers that we've written. APTP made a very intentional decision that one of our strands of work was going to be impacting the public debate, that we were going to make a movement, that you were no longer going to call our dead loved ones the suspect that was shot by law enforcement on the corner of 26th and Adeline. He had a name, he had a family, it's a human being. Because if you are allowed to ignore the humanity, then you can ignore the problem. So you see even that conversation is being shifted. The types of people that are getting elected at the local, state, and federal level, the state is reacting, right? And the state is doing what it always does, right? They've offered us concessions. Well, here's a body camera, or here's some training, or here's some, right? And Black people and our allies have continued to say, no, that's not enough, right? Because we're still dying. And so this moment that we're in says, yes, it worked. And it's because we have turned up the heat and continue to escalate and turn up the heat, and are going to continue to escalate and turn up the heat until Black death by cop is not a daily occurrence in the United States of America.
So Black death by cop, when that conversation starts, it's not unusual to have people respond by saying, you're focusing on cops, but there's so much Black on Black violence in communities, Black people killing each other. How do you respond when people bring that up in an effort to say that that is the true problem, the real root of the problem? What's really killing Black folks is Black folks.
You used an interesting word, the word root, the root of the problem. The root of Black people killing Black people is not Black people. The root of Black people killing Black people, and poor white people killing poor white people, and poor Asian people killing poor Asian people, and poor Latinx people killing poor Latinx people is the state. And so what we say is all violence is state violence, because it is the state that creates the conditions that allow that type of behavior to perpetrate. Meaning, when people have mental health and trauma supports, when people have adequate food, clothing, shelter, education, economic opportunity, guess what? Crime, so-called crime, that. When people can forge a living in the above ground economy, they don't have to make a living in the underground economy. So I ask you, if you needed to eat, like really, not just like you were trying to figure out how to get from, what you have in your pocket this week as a college student to next week. But I mean, really needed to eat, or you had children to feed, a mother to take care of. How far are you willing to go? I'm the mother of a 15-year-old. Luckily, I have jobs. I have work. I promise you, if I needed to feed my daughter and I had tried all of the traditional pathways to being able to do that, I'm going to do what I have to do. And so the state has fallen down on this job. The state breaks people. It literally breaks people. We track Black children literally from schools into prisons, or as Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. says, American concentration camps, right? Where they are beaten, they are tortured, they are starved, they witness horrific trauma, and then we spit them back out onto the street with no resources, support, to therapy, and we say, and if you breathe wrong, we're going to send you back. Under those conditions, would you be able to forge a successful life? Are you going to be able to deal with the PTSD that you were living with every single day, and get up and go to work and do all the things that you're supposed to do? And so, yes, all violence is state violence. And actually, and there's, folks make this case in different ways. The Black man living next to me, it's not his job to protect me. He's not the person that I'm supposed to call when I'm in danger. His job, right? He's just another person trying to survive the madness that is this American experiment, just like me. And so it's actually worse. It's actually worse when cops kill us, right? Because where do we go? There is nowhere to go.
So it sounds like what you're proposing is police abolition or some form of it. No, tell me what it is that you're proposing.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I was looking. We're going to get to the chat.
Okay,
later,
okay. There you go.
Said again because I was looking.
So, but there's a diversity of opinion within Black and Brown communities about the role that police should play in containing and controlling crime and bringing lawmakers to justice. How do you make sense of this diversity of perspective? And what do you say to those who contend that public safety cannot be ensured without the presence of police, without that force to make people, fall in line?
Well, of course, there's a diversity of opinion. Black people are not a monolith. I mean, I know folks wish we were. I wish people say, well, Ava DuVernay said that the Black folks want blah, blah, blah. That's just not the reality. We have different lived experience. We live in different parts of the country. Our experience of white supremacy and racism is different. There's Black folks that have made it per se, right? And they have one analysis, and then there's folks that are living in the type of poverty I can't even imagine. So of course there's diversity of opinion. All I can do is take my informed opinion, right? And that's important because everybody can have an opinion. But if it's not, my ex-husband, he used to wow, 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 wow out the mouth. Based on what? Which book did you read, right? Well, I watched the news. I'm sorry, CNN, MSNBC, that didn't cut it, right? Your informed opinion. All I can take is my informed opinion, plus my lived experience, plus my deep engagement with the people, right? And the conversations that I'm having with the people. And from there, create an organizing strategy, which isn't about leading the people around by their nose, right? And that's the other thing. Like organizers don't go in and put magic juice inside of people's water. We don't brainwash people. We go in and have conversations about where they're at, and we ask them, what about your life would you like to see shift? And then we work to build power from the ground up, because that's the only kind of power that actually matters. And if you have a different opinion than I do, or the people that I organize with do, then you should do your own organizing. Right. But if the organizing that you're doing is in facilitation of the state's objectives and keep our people in the gutter, then you're going to hear from us. And then I think you asked me a question about the levels of crime now. Oh, the only mechanism to keep us safe. My question would be to you: is it working? Is it? I mean, look at America's crime stats and tell me, is it working? The answer is no. And I'll localize it to Oakland, right? So in the city of Oakland, where I live, we give almost 50% of our yearly budget to the Oakland Police Department. And every single year, we remain on the list of the top 10 most violent cities in America. It's not working for anybody. Right. And so this moment, what we're talking about, when we talk about reimagine public safety, we're talking about getting to the gun before the bullet flies, instead of standing with the mother as she puts her child in the ground. For folks that human life doesn't matter to you, we're talking about getting to the kid before he breaks your window to steal whatever he's stealing to sell it to eat. That he's got a full belly. She's got a roof over her head. Right. And so, I laughed and I didn't get to it. The word radical. I love that word. I think it's such a delicious word. Right. And we say radical means rational. Right. Is it radical to say that 14-year-old kids playing in the park shouldn't be shot dead by law enforcement? Is it radical to believe that everybody should have a roof over their head? Everybody. Is it radical to believe that people should have food in their mouth every single day? Or are those things that should just happen in societies that claim that they are not morally bankrupt? You tell me.
What do you do without police? Right. That's the next question. How do you achieve safety, security without police? Because you present the is it working, but what people are often imagining is how much worse it would be if you actually remove them from the scene. So then the question becomes,
Because how do you know it's going to be worse?
Yeah.
Let's sit with that, because you've never experienced that. You have never lived in a world where you didn't have a militarized occupying army as the definition of safety. Now think about that too. A militarized police department that literally have tanks that roll down certain community streets. That's safety. Putting hurt people back on the street after they've encountered one of the most violent institutions in the world. That's safety. I mean, think about it. It's not working. And we're not saying, okay, tomorrow, like everybody's going to wake up tomorrow, there will be an absence of any type of law enforcement anywhere. And I'm gonna call, and I said this to you, in our pre-talk, and I'm gonna say it here, and I've said in papers. I think people have this image of Black folks running crazy, running wild in the streets, right, doing all of the things that you imagine that we want to do. We're also not talking about we need nothing. We need something. We absolutely need something. Right. But does that something need to look like what we currently have? And our resounding answer is no. And that actually what we currently have exacerbates the problem, doesn't help it. So you build replicable alternative models. You test things out. You try things. In the Laurel District in Oakland, we have Community Ready Corps. They are and that's a business district. The businesses call them first. You try it out. right? We're working on a model of response to interpersonal violence. You try it out. But what we can't keep doing, what to me is radical in the sense that it doesn't make any sense, and it's certainly illogical, is continue doing the same thing. Well, that's the definition of insanity, right? Now what they say, doing the exact same thing and expecting different results.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll talk to the white folks here. What we're doing isn't working for you either. It's not working for you either, because and it's majority white folks, but it's black folks too. This idea you have in your head of what the cops do, if you just sit for a minute, is not your lived reality. And if it was your lived reality, you wouldn't be so terrified of crime, because you wouldn't know what it is so deeply.
So across the country, people are pointing to the spikes in violence, maybe as a result of COVID, maybe in response to the constant viewing of new Black folks being murdered. Who knows what it's in response to, but across the country, we see these spikes. And so the response, at least by some, to this is we can't defund the police. Of course, we can look at these spikes. What are we supposed to do with the increase in violence that we see across the country? Who's going to manage that? Who's going to control that? So there's this response to the defund the police movement, pointing to things like spikes in violence, spikes in crime, as why the police remain a legitimate force. How do you respond to those kinds of concerns, critiques?
Now you all are way smarter than I am. I could have never gotten into an institution like yours. So I think it'll take us nothing but a minute to debunk or to deconstruct this logic. The police have the funding now. The police are in power to deal with this now. We haven't defunded anything or anyone or any institution. And yet spikes in crime persist in every major city across the country, and the cops aren't able to deal with it. To me, that is a resounding argument to invest in something else and to stop throwing good money after bad, because clearly what they do, the patterns and practices that they have in place, and the way that they are going about things isn't working.
You mentioned some of the new models that you're trying on in order to see if it has impact, and we'll keep trying until we find more models. Can you point to some grassroots movements or even models that seek to address police violence, racial inequities in the penal system, public safety issues, maybe broadly speaking, that you really are you feel really optimistic about, that this might actually do some of the work in terms of making some of our communities safer than they have been, and allowing people to heal? And what have you seen that you are excited about?
I think one of the things that I'm the most excited about is this movement of healing justice.
Mhm.
So I grew up in the old school of organizing, where you smoked and drank and worked yourself to death. I mean, that's just what it was, right? There were no breaks to it. This term self-care,
Mhm.
we don't know nothing about that.
Mhm.
Um, and then also we didn't have that element I was talking about addressing people's trauma, communities' trauma, individuals' trauma, not looking at things in a holistic way. So I'll take interpersonal violence, which I'm a survivor of, and what we're building around that is dear to my heart. If you only focus on the survivor, but you ignore the children and you ignore the perpetrator, what's going to happen? It's going to continue. And so this idea that we are taking our whole community in our arms, and it's not about not holding people accountable whatsoever, because accountability is a thing, right? But that we're starting to have these conversations about holistic responses to trauma and violence. I'm excited about the alternative models, right? Like we started the Defund OPD campaign 5 years ago, following the revelation of a woman that she's a woman then. She'd been being trafficked by the Oakland Police Department and 13 other law enforcement agency for 14, but a total of 14 other law enforcement agency for years. I'm excited Black Youth Project 100. They give me hyphy, right? Like, and um, I just love the work that I've seen them do. Um, you know, I've got critiques and blessings for all organizations, you know, including my own. I think, you know, the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's important for folks to understand that there's Black Lives Matter, the organization, and then there's the hashtag under which, you know, organizing happened. They're not always interchangeable. But Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders, is very near and dear to my heart. She's actually who I co-founded the Justice Teams Network with. I'm excited about her brain. I'm thrilled about the decarceration movement, particularly as we have this conversation about cannabis, which way too many Black people are still languishing in jails for. Like, we're moving, right? Like, I'm not going to see us get to where I want us to be in my lifetime, but I think we're in a place of extraction as opposed to just dialogue. That super excites me for our evolution as a country, but that to me, you know, on a more woo-woo level, as my boyfriend says, speaks to me about our evolution as human beings.
Woo level.
Um,
My final question, I think. So in cities across the country, legislators are putting forward bills that seek to reform the criminal legal system, trying to address these issues of police brutality and other kind of racial inequities. You know, so the strategies, you know, are intended to increase transparency and accountability. You know, they focused on a lot of things like limits on police use of force, increased use of body-worn cameras, implicit bias training, citizen review boards, better training, more training. The list goes on. But I think that those are some of the ones that show up quite a bit. What do you think about these efforts? And what do you say to those who contend that we've made significant progress over the past 20 so years? The rates of violence, police against Black and brown people, that's declined. And you know, we just need a little bit more time and a few more tweaks here and there. We'll continue to make progress. That, you know, progress is short. We just need to be patient. What do you say to folks who make these arguments and point to these kinds of efforts, legislative efforts, as evidence that progress is in the making?
I'm trying to think about where I want to start. I think where I want to start is like there's reform, and then there's reform, right? And so for a hot minute, APTP, we didn't engage in reform. And the reason why we didn't engage in reform was because reform is about fixing things. Policing isn't broken. You know, it's not. You can't fix something that ain't broke. Policing in this country was born out of indigenous genocide and the slave trade. Its job then was to catch, kill, and contain Black bodies in the service of race-based capitalism, and it's still doing its job, right? And so the cops, you know, get all like, take this stuff all personally, right? I'm a good person. It's not about you, fool. It's about the institution that you work for. It's not a couple of bad apples, right? It's the whole damn orchard, and we need to uproot the whole thing and replant some new stuff. And if you want to push back at me on that, you tell me at what year since the first slave patrols to now, what year it was that policing went awry? What year is it that we just need to get back to? And if we just start doing what we were doing in that year, that you tell me, if we just go back to doing that everything is going to be okay for everybody. I challenge you to do that. You're not going to find a year, because there's never a year where it was working right for anybody. People say that it's declined. I would like to know what data set, right? What years are you talking about? Because in the years that I've been tracking this, it's actually remained a pretty steady average, somewhere between 980 and 1,200 people every single year that law enforcement kills. And where I live in California, we have the most violent law enforcement departments in the country. That's right, sunny, progressive California. Our cops kill more people than anybody else, while similarly providing them with more transparency and accountability protections than anywhere else. So remember when I was talking earlier, I said the state gives us concessions, right? The state wants us to go back to work, make money, spend money, and shut up. Right? That is what the state wants us to do. And so they do things, particularly when things escalate to a particular way. Like, how do we prevent this from becoming an actual thing that we have to deal with in the only way? Like, if we were ever an actual threat to the state, your country would do things to our bodies that you can't imagine. You can't imagine. You imagine the stuff happening in Honduras or Guatemala or other places, right, that we demonize, even though all that stuff is happening with U.S. support. That's not this talk. But that's reality. And so they do things like they give us trainings, and God bless Dr. Everhart. Like I feel bad sometimes when we get to this part of the conversation, because I actually have never met the woman. I think she's very smart, and I actually think she cares about Black people very deeply. But you can't say implicit bias to me, because I'm gonna say, you mean racism? You can't say explicit bias to me, because you mean violent racism, right? Because that's what we're talking about. And I'm gonna quote Chairman Fred Jr. Again, because he's an ally and a comrade and someone that I maybe have to explain who that is, but we'll hold on to that. When you water down the words, when you start speaking in euphemism, you water down the will of the people to resist. So we have to call things what they are. It's not state, it's not police brutality, it's state violence or state terror. They're not prisons, they're American concentration camps, and it's not gentrification, it's a land grab. And let's so be real about what we're talking about. So those terms were made to make that so that the cops felt comfortable having the conversation. This isn't a comfortable conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation. Right? Just like what Trump has exposed in this country, right? The cancerous tumor of racism that we have buried with policy and respectability politics. And look, we've gone past this. He ripped the cover off of that. And all of a sudden, America is forced to look at who the hell America has always been. That is actually, though, a good thing, because it gives us an opportunity to actually deal with the shit, to radiate the hell out of that thing, to put healing oils on it, to do whatever we have to do to get to the other side. So we can't be having these conversations comfortably. It's not comfortable for the mother of Tamir Rice to talk about the murder of her son. It's not comfortable for Oscar's mother to talk about the murder of her son. These are not comfortable conversations. Body cameras. Guess what we found out about body cameras? Cops that had them on were actually more likely to perpetrate violence than not. And why were they not useful for Black people? Because whose perspective do they show? Not ours. They show the cops' perspective. Police commissions, the Black Panther Party, one of their early and consistent demands was about civilian control of the police, civilian control of whatever it is that we have that's, implementing the rules. Because we do need rules, right? As a society, we need rules, and who's enforcing those rules and how. And I believe in that deeply. And I think that one day we'll create a police commission that actually has teeth to pull us into radical reforms, which don't tinker around the edges of this behemoth, but actually blow the whole goddamn thing up and then lovingly replace it with something new that works for all of us. That commission doesn't exist, not here in Oakland. There's folks that'll lie to you about that, not here in Oakland either. So that's what I think about those things. I think we keep doing them, but ultimately we started engaging in the reform world so we could push radical reforms that don't reinforce the status quo. And also because we were like, okay, we're being a little full of ourselves, aren't we? Because the reality is we're saying we're not going to engage in reforms that might actually stem a little bit the tide of Black bodies falling all over this country. And so we believe it's all roads in. We need reforms. We need alternative models. We need, community driven things. We need cops not being the answer to social ills. We need all of the things at all of the governmental levels, and most importantly at the grassroots community level.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Chris. Chris, do you have questions for Kat?
Sure, I have a few. Thank you very much for being here and your very interesting talk. So first of all, two related questions. What cities do you think you've had the most been most effective in, and why?
So I think we've been the most effective, where we live, and the region that we live in. So Oakland, San Francisco, Sacramento, and then Vallejo, and then I would say that moves its way south. I'm not sure if the why is why have we been effective, or why what do I judge that effectiveness by?
No, it's the first, sort of how is it that you're changing police departments? What's going on inside the department results in their behavior actually changing?
Yeah, movement building, organizing is the cure for all things, right? And it looks differently, but what we're really clear about in the city of Oakland is that we built a movement to where the Oakland Police Department, the mayor, city council, they were very clear that every time you kill us, we're going to shut this whole thing down, and nothing is moving until we feel like it's going to move again. I think too that we grew up and we started, playing in the reform world and being able to push through some progressive reforms and resolutions. I think because we've been having, conversations with the people and engaging in deep relationship with the people. And I think that people, BIPOC people in particular, were hungry for something to fall into and with very little requirements, right? Like the only thing you need to organize with us is want the world to be better and different. And then I think because we do have replicable models, and we say very clearly, so the way that we do first responders, the first thing that we're going to say to you when we come to your city is these are the basic tenets and principles, but you have to adapt them for you. So where we have seen impact in places like Chicago, in parts of so-called Canada, Philly, Detroit, the tenets of APTP, and they will say, right, that we got these skills from APTP, but they've made it their own, and we were very intentional. I think the other thing is that we have we are a multicultural organization, so we're Black led, and we're unapologetic about that, right? That those that are closest and most impacted by the solution, that we are the leadership, but we work with we've got a huge white base, and we engage our white allies to do what we think their job is, and that's to go talk to other white people, so we can, be about the business of liberation. And we found that incredibly effective. So off the top of my head, I mean, I would say that's why. Oh, and I'm sorry, and impacting the public debate, that we've successfully changed the way media talks about police violence.
So do you think mayors are important, or is it mayors who were super concerned about all the bad press, the shutdowns and so on? They're telling their police departments it's got to stop.
No, I would never give Libby Schaaf credit for telling the police department that the violence had to stop. I think what Libby probably said is we have to find a way to get out of the national news. And then that pushes folks to do things differently. I think mayors play a crucial role, or excuse me, I think mayors have a crucial role to play in where it is we're trying to go. I think that there are very few mayors across the country, and certainly not the woman that currently holds that title where I live, that are actually willing to engage in the serious work of getting it done. But just imagine if you had a visionary, right, leading the city, that was working in true partnership with community and placing the health and welfare of our most marginalized communities at the top, right, of the city's agenda. What a city that would be.
So the concern I have is we have something like 18,000 police departments in this country.
Is that
fatal police shootings have actually dropped a fair bit, like by a third in, say, the 50 largest cities. But they haven't dropped overall, as you pointed out, and that's because it's moving to the suburbs and out into the rural areas. And kind of wondering, sort of what kind of strategy might be effective in dealing with all the shootings, fatal police shootings that go on outside of large cities, and many of them in very small towns, maybe a little bit more difficult to organize.
Yes and no. I mean, police will stop. The police killings are reduced when human, civilian engagement with police are reduced. And so I think it's a multi-pronged strategy. I think one, identifying the places where we can disentangle law enforcement from our communities, where the places we don't actually need them to be, is one. I think two, organizing one-on-one is you meet people where they're at, right? And so who and where and what are the organizations that can go to the places where we're seeing spikes in police violence and have conversations and offer trainings and support so that they can build their own movements. I think continuing to sort of push on the fact that it's not about individual police officers or individual police departments, but talking about it as an institution that needs to be reimagined and rebuilt. I think ultimately we'll find that to be an incredibly powerful tool. And I think local elections and supporting campaign work that engages communities of, you know, the BIPOC community. I think we're going to see that increasingly important as well.
So, homicide rates in the U.S. have dropped something like nationally 40% over the last couple of decades. In Oakland, 2006, you had 145, and 2019, you had 75, so that's almost a 50% drop. Now, 2020, like lots of places, you're up to 102. It'll be very interesting to see what happens after COVID.
Well, we're at 22 in 2021. Well, excuse me, we were at 22 when I last looked a few days ago.
Yeah, right. Whatever.
But it's not whatever. Because
Hopefully, dealing with COVID
what
was
saying is that it's going to continue. That the trend is continuing.
You think it's going to continue?
I do think it's going to continue, and I tie it directly to, you know, the failure. Right, we spent a lot of time talking about how horribly Trump responded to COVID, and he gets to hold all of those things, and we mourn all of the deaths that are a result of his mismanagement of the spread of this pandemic. Locally, not much better. The messages were wrong. The PPE wasn't getting out. We didn't get our unhoused people into the places that they need. There weren't extra protections and care for essential workers. And all of those things exacerbated pre-existing social conditions. And I don't think it's going to get better, because even though anytime soon, I do think ultimately things will ease. But, you know, so here in California, you know, as the numbers go down and we start to reopen, it's still going to take, the vaccine is going to work faster than the things that we need to do to make an economic recovery. And the people that are going to continue to feel the impact of the economic nightmare that this was are going to continue to be Black and brown people in communities that were already devastatingly poor.
Thank you. Why don't we open up to the audience, Sandra?
Sounds good. So just so you are aware, Kat.
Uh-oh. You're on mute.
Unmute. There you go. Okay. So just so you know, Kat, a number of people had to leave at 5:30, but they put a message in the chat saying they very much appreciated this much needed conversation. So I just want you to know that before I head off to the folks who are still here. Christy Love, do you want to ask your question and or make your comment?
Yes, and before I have to jump off soon too, I appreciate the comment. I appreciate you know, some of the things you said have made me feel uncomfortable, but I intentionally sit in the conversation because I agree that feelings of discomfort is what helps us grow. Someone, I think it was Chris, just raised the issue about Oakland, the previous reduction in shootings, and you were saying nothing has worked, you know, when you're looking at policing. And I understand that police were a big part of this Oakland ceasefire plan. So I just, you being an Oakland resident, being active in the community, just interested in your perspectives on that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think if ceasefire had worked, and in Oakland, you know, if you don't know who Ben and Michael McBride are, folks should know who Ben and Michael McBride are. They're two pastors who are engaged in this work in some pretty amazing and phenomenal ways. And they were unusual suspects in terms of the primary partners with the Oakland Police Department to do Oakland's special brand of ceasefire. And the pieces of the program that worked, right, were the engagement of the McBride brothers with the community. The pieces of the program that didn't work was the stick that is law enforcement that is a piece of this. And I guess my contention would be that because we invested so much time and money into ceasefire, that should have been about building foundational structures and things that prevented us from backsliding. But it didn't, and we didn't, right? So what we're seeing in Oakland right now, if ceasefire had been a success, to me, maybe some backslide, but we should, there's no way that we should be looking at what we're looking at right now. And again, that's because we continue to try to put Band-Aids on gunshot wounds. as opposed to actually dealing with what's happening, investing their resources where they need to be invested. And, you know, Christy, I think part of that too is the same reason why on a larger national level, we're not getting at the things that we need to get at, right? Because then you have to actually talk about what's wrong. Then you actually have to admit that you've been treating Black people like shit post 1964, right? Then you have to admit what you've been denying and robbing resources. Like, then you have to have that conversation. And until we're willing to do that, unfortunately, I think absent of community models and organizing, we're going to continue to be in this pattern. And this pattern harms BIPOC folks the most.
All right, thanks. And then
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The other quick thing, you know, I hear that a lot, like, oh, if we solve poverty, if we better educate, if we give resources, we won't have violence. And so I put the comment in there, but, you know, we still have the case. It's just a small percent of those people who are living in deplorable conditions that are engaging in this violence.
Facts, so, but that small percent is wreaking an amazing amount of havoc.
And they are, but that makes me think, since it's such a small percent, can we really say that's the root cause?
So where I'll push back on you about is on, so you were very specific about violent crime, right? And let me just say, I hate the word crime and I hate everything it connotes. Crime expands way beyond violent crime, and actually people that are languishing, you know, in American concentration camps, the vast majority of them aren't there for violent crime. That's not the vast. They're there because they had mental health issues. They're there because they were unhoused. They're there because they had substance abuse issues, like my daddy, right? So we're talking about getting to the root causes of all of those things. Why do Black people in America feel the need to medicate ourselves? And I would argue that most of us can't make it through being Black in this country without some sort of medication. Why is that? Why do our 8-year-old children have post-traumatic stress disorder? Those are the root causes we're talking about getting underneath. Why in Oakland are we looking at, by the age of 13, way too many young women ending up on what's called the blade? And for folks who don't know what the blade is, that's where they put our babies out to sell their bodies, primarily to white clients. Right? Like, those are the things that we're talking about. It's not just violent crime. It's not just the homicides. Actually, I feel like that can be dealt with fairly easily. It's a bigger bucket.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So Lynette Culverhouse, would you like to make your point, ask a question?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. This is so great. I see the huge problem in the way the culture defines crime. And, you know, historically, we were taught to fear the witches rather than those who burned them. And it's still happening. I mean, the real criminals are the ones that are causing the crime. And on every protest that I've ever been on, the police out there watching the protesters and protecting the property owners. And, what point or how do we address the way that the conversation is publicly had? Like, I mean, through the media and social media, but the media, largely journalism, always projects stories from the perspective of the owners of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
How do we?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, I am working towards that change in my work, but of course, just me or just my organization, we're not going to change all that. We were unapologetic in terms of our engagement with media and insisting that they change the way they talk about our people. So they actually needed us, right? They needed sources, they needed people to talk to. And so we just stopped talking. We talked to you about how you were, and we're not going to talk about our people. And we asked you, and then we demanded, and then we just stopped talking to you, right? And we started talking about you. And that shifted some power dynamics. I think these kinds of conversations are super important. And I think that people need to have them out, you know, in whatever issue area you're engaged in, right? This happens to be my issue area, but you can have the same conversation if you're talking straight up about education, if you're talking about climate change, if you're talking about access to affordable housing. And I think we forget, Lynette, that the power does lie with us, and it's the biggest gaslight ever, right? It really is, the way in which our government and the media engage with us. It is the biggest gas. They will do things to us, right, in the process of doing it, and tell you know we're not doing that, right? And Americans, we like to be comfortable. We
Yeah.
like our Nikes, we like our nice cars, we like, we would like to be comfortable. And holding things accountable, holding systems accountable often means the forfeiture of some of that comfort. And so a lot of the work that we have to do also is with each other, right? How are we building the movement that actually does impact the things that you brought up?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I also think about, the perpetrators of torture and Guantanamo and, people being put in cages, children being put in cages, and all of those crimes that we just, we don't do anything about them. And which, yeah.
It was 2014, 2015, somewhere around there, around BLM time. I told you this story. And I was doing an interview, and I was taking a walk, and the reporter asked me, why do you think that white folks are having such a hard time accepting that this is the lived reality of Black people? And I didn't have the answer right off the top of my tongue. I just had to sit for a second, and what came to me, and I think because I have such an extensive experience in marketing and branding and communications, I started to think about, like, what do white people believe America is, right? And how do they get that information? And I am saying white people in general terms, right? Like broadly. But really, y'all are told from the time you're in your mom's womb, right? Like, this is your shit. You are the cream of the crop, right? You have a right to everything. Right, all of these things, and you're simultaneously told, and you live in the greatest country on the planet, and this is the greatest democracy ever, and we're the land of the free and the brave, and everybody else around us is shite, right? And that becomes part of people's identity, right? And then so when you start to have conversations with people about what we're doing, right? So we can point at Putin, or we can point at the little dude in North Korea, we can point at all these other people. We have a very hard time pointing the finger at ourselves, because and when we're asking people to do that, it feels like we're asking them to sacrifice a piece of their identity. And we need a new identity in this country. And we have to say that if we're going to walk around making these claims about being so fucking awesome, we sure as hell better start looking like it, acting like it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. So next up is Ray Simpson. Ray, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. My question is that here in Cambridge, some of us are working on these issues, looking at issues of mobile mental health crisis response teams. And we're hearing a lot about Oakland, a collaborative effort there involving urban strategies, mental health first, an effort to create a kind of a major alternative to the police around mental health crisis response. I'm just wondering what you think of that in Oakland and what you think of that as an approach.
Well, since we created it, I'm gonna give a ringing endorsement of Mental Health First. It's a program of the Anti-Police Terror Project. This is an important time for history, because accurate history is important. 5 years ago, we started the Defund OPD campaign. We had one demand: redirect 50% of OPD's resources into 24/7 mental health resources, and the creation of an alternative response to mental health crisis that didn't leave people dead, right? Seemed like a pretty basic demand to me. People thought we were insane. And fast forward a couple of years, we finally looked at each other and we were like, what are we doing? We are asking the state to build the thing that we need for the people. And so Anti-Police Terror Project stopped waiting, and we built MH First, and I'm super excited, and the people are super excited. And I can't remember if we had a call with Cambridge or if we got an email, but that's ringing up.
We've had meetings, yeah.
Yeah, it's ringing a bell. Okay, so I'm right, and so that's, and then the state wanted some control of it, and so they're building what's called macro mobile Mobile Assistance Community Responders of Oakland. And we kicked and screamed for a place at that table, which we ultimately got. And we're in a fight right now about where, well, we just want to fight about where it's going to be housed, which is going to be with our fire department. The big fight for us now, though, is that the tenets of why we needed an alternative, right? The criminalization and stigmatization of Black bodies in mental health crisis, that's not transferred to the alternative programs, right? Because it's not just about changing who responds, it's about changing how we respond. And so to roundabout way of answering your question, we are very much, I haven't slept really for 2 weeks because we've been pumping out all this stuff to get, the city to support macro and engage community, but supporting macro, since that is going to be the city program. And then figuring out how we can stick our big pushy noses in there as much as possible so that it is done through a social justice lens. And I think that we're going to be able to do that. And I think Oakland's going to be able to be a model for the country, because the worst thing that can happen is people keep dying because they're calling for help. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. And then perhaps finally, Joshua Baltadano. Joshua?
Yeah, sorry about that. It was on mute. Sorry, I don't have my video either, but I was just curious. Thank you for being with us, Kat Brooks. It's kind of rare to have a voice like yours, especially in this space of Harvard. But I was curious with your experience, working, with the white allies within the community, and then having white allies maybe seek out working with other white folks. Like, there's just been this new wave with the DSA. I know you had experience with DSA East Bay. I'm here from the Mission District here in Frisco, 26 in Shotwell to be exact. But I guess like working with like folks here, like I'm a part of the Latinx coalition, Latinx Dems, whatever. But I guess I've seen like a lot of DSA folks, this new wave trying to be organized, but it's a lot of folks that are transplants. They're not even from the city. And then I don't know, it's just kind of like really interesting. Like, obviously I try or like work with our folks to educate the youth, but just kind of weird. Like, even this last election cycle in November, we see like Kamala Harris and all these folks like come out, and I'm like, what? Like, Kamala Harris started gang injunctions on this block like years ago. Like, it's just kind of weird, I guess. Yeah. Just curious what your experience has been, and like really trying to make sure that these coalitions and everything don't get monopolized by the wrong folks. Yeah.
See, you trying to get me in trouble. So I'll tell us. I know we are out of time, but if folks want to hang tight, I'm going to tell a story and then I'm going to answer the question. So, it's not just me. I work with a tribe of folks, and myself and now Councilmember Carol Fife. This was during the mayoral run. We're at the California State Democratic Party convention at the Marriott in Oakland. And got a phone call from a white ally who said, yo, I'm at the East Bay DSA meeting and they are talking mad shit, right? And about you, about the work, about APTP, the campaign, you guys have to get down here. And being who we are, we immediately left the Democratic convention and got in the car and we went. And initially our plan was just to listen, right? Like, if you're, and I'm that way. Like, if you have an issue of anything I said on this, please call me, email me, hit me, right? We can have the conversation. But if you're going to be talking about me, I'm going to find a way to be in the room, because people say a lot of crazy stuff about you when you're not in the room. So we were in the room, and then they opened it up to public comment, and my co-founder of APTP and all things amazing, Terha Ak, who's also the founder of Community Ready Corps, which will be relevant to this conversation momentarily, got in the line to speak, and they asked a question about, could people who weren't members of DSA speak? And at first they said yes, not realizing that it was Terha that the question was being asked for. I should say that this room is probably 98.5% white. And when this big Black man who literally bleeds for our community got up there to speak, they tried to tell him he could not. That didn't go over very well. And so we forced the situation so he could speak. I ended up addressing the crowd, and I think I started by saying something to the effect of, I've been organizing in this city longer than most of you have lived here, and how inappropriate their behavior was. That exploded. It blew a whole bunch of stuff up, right? It actually created division in DSA, and there was an DSA East Bay, and there was active organizing to prevent the endorsement of my mayoral campaign. And you know, we do hold them accountable for partially accountable for what Libby Schaaf does. I got 43,000 first place votes. Unheard of for someone who's never run for office. And but large, like half of DSA ended up working for us. And then very strangely, San Francisco DSA endorsed my campaign, right? And so this division thing happened. But what's important about that is that we don't play with white allies, right? Like, we don't back down, and we don't create situations where you are dominating any conversation. You don't get to tell me how you're going to build strategy on my bloody back, period. Your place in this conversation is not at the front of the line. And there are some Black folks and brown folks and other BIPOC folks that'll dance with you. We are not those people. Never have been, never will be. And so I mean, I think that's it. I think to be unapologetic about it, but not unapologetic in a nasty way, right? But for that to be rooted, right, in political analysis. And the reason why I said Terha would be important is, I'm gonna put am I allowed to, yeah, I'm gonna put a link in the chat that folks could look at. He is the founder of an organization called Community Ready Corps, and what they have are Community Ready Corps allies and accomplices, and they sought to create that group, and that's the white folks that defer to Black leadership, but then go organize other white folks. And what they created was the divestment and weaponization of white power and privilege, right? And what you were supposed to do as white people with your power and your privilege, if you're going to tell me you're an ally. And for us, if you're not invested in these 5 steps, if you're not committed to doing these things, then you can go organize with somebody else.
Wow, that's great. Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to win. We're trying to get free. We're not trying to recreate the dynamics we have here, and we just don't have enough time in the day to coddle folks. And to me, if you're truly about being an ally or accomplice, you shouldn't have any issues following that program. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, and now we're 5 minutes over, is if you are, and I don't want an ally, I want accomplices, right? Like, I want people that are getting the grit and the grime and the mud, right? Like at the end of the day, I shouldn't be the only one sitting in the jail cell, right? That I'm gonna be mad, and we're gonna have a whole conversation about that when I get out, right? What are you willing to put on the line, and what conversations are you willing to go have with your own people? Because quite honestly, most of us BIPOC folks are tired of making the argument to your cousins. That's your work.
Okay, thank you so much, Joshua, for your engagement. Kat, this has been really extraordinary for me, and I imagine most on this call, if not all. The power of your voice. You're an inspiration. So thank you for sharing this. I would love to know more about the Anti-Police Terror Project. And so I'm going to be staying in touch with you and figuring out how it's growing and what it's doing on the ground. And then perhaps one day you and I can share a cell together. It will be an honor. So thank you very much. We will stay in touch. Really appreciate it. And I hope to see the rest of you all next week when we come back together to have a conversation with Senator Brownsberger. I will be in touch, Kat. Thank you so much.
Y'all take care. Thank you. Stay healthy.